But this is going to be a new series I call Basic Theology. I know that sounds very simple, but there's much more to it than sound. Basic Theology, and let me put this aside since most of what I'm going to give you this hour is simply a list of books, kind of a quick review, book review of some materials I've come across over the last few years that have been very helpful and informative on the subject of God. I'll give you a teaser for next week. Our first part will be on the existence of God. Theology, the word theology means the study of God. And it's difficult to study God if you don't think He's there. So that's where we will begin next week. However, today I dragged out a stack of books I want to just call your attention to. This one has been very popular over the last few years by a famous biologist named Richard Dawkins, probably the most vocal atheist right now, and called The God Delusion. The idea that you're deluded if you believe in God. And just a side remark, we were watching Richard Dawkins at an atheist rally in Washington, D.C. I guess it was held earlier in the year or maybe last year. And he told the audience, thousands of people gathered there, that what atheists need to do is to make fun of God and make fun of religion, to belittle them, to mock them every chance you get, and show them how foolish their idea is. And to which another Christian apologist named Ravi Zacharias said, I agree with him. He should be able to say those things and mock religion. And I would suggest he first go to Saudi Arabia and practice that. See how far he gets with it. But his famous book is called The God Delusion. A couple of books that were takeoffs from his title. One called The Delusion of Disbelief, Why the New Atheism Threatens Your Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness in America, by a man named David Aikman. I think he also wrote a biography of President George W. Bush, on the faith of George W. Bush. This was very good. By the way, you're welcome to see me if you ever want to borrow any of these books that I call your attention to. Here's another one, takeoff from that title, called The Devil's Delusion, about the folly of atheism. Atheism and Scientific Pretensions by David Berlinski. I do not think he is a professing Christian either. David Aikman, The Delusion of Disbelief, I think he is a professing believer. Here's a book called, the title says, There Is No God, and then you see the word no crossed out so that the title reads, There Is a God. And this was one of the last books written by a man named Anthony Flew, F-L-E-W. He was the most celebrated, the most reputed atheist in the world up until just a couple years before he died. He died about 3 or 4 years ago. But before he died, he came to the decision that he cannot explain the existence of everything through natural means. There had to have been some divine cause. And so he wrote this book called There Is a God, and retracted much of what he earlier believed. Of course, he made atheists all around the world mad that he would even entertain such ideas. The problem with Mr. Flew, I think he was from Great Britain, he makes no profession of having found Jesus Christ before he died. He simply came to the decision that life cannot be fully explained by natural reasons alone, through natural reasoning alone. There had to have been a divine God involved. Well, I'm glad he came to that decision, but it's like too little too late if you die without Jesus Christ. Here's a book by a lady named Alicia Cole called Finding an Unseen God. She was a former atheist, and she tells her story of how she came to the Lord Jesus Christ at a church meeting someone had invited her to, someone she had gone to high school with. I tracked this lady down. She lives in Branson, Missouri. I tracked her down and left a voicemail for her. And several weeks later, I got a return phone call out of the blue on my cell phone and had a good talk with her over the phone. And she offered me, sent me another book on, women's devotional book that she had also written, which I really wasn't interested in the women's devotional books per se. But I had a good visit with this lady who tells about her conversion to the Lord Jesus, having been a former atheist. This book by Peter Hitchens, the younger brother of the late Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens, funny thing, Christopher means Christ bearer, someone who takes Christ to other people. Now, if someone wanted to be an atheist and they were named Christopher, I think to be intellectually honest, they ought to change their name to something that doesn't reflect any biblical definition. But his younger brother, Peter Hitchens, was raised an atheist just like he was, a secularist. They both believed in the power of the state and the powers of, or rather the virtues of Marxism and socialism and communism. And then he began to see the influence of communism on society, certain parts of Europe and Russia. And he was living with a girlfriend, and they were on a vacation together, and he saw a painting from the Renaissance on the Last Judgment. And he said for the first time in his life, he noticed the characters in that painting who were heading towards the fires of hell and God's judgment. They were depicted as naked in the painting. And he said for the first time he looked at that, and he said he had been afraid of many things. He was in Russia as a correspondent and had been shot at by communist soldiers during the Cold War and had been trapped out in the snow with fearing for his life in China and other places as a writer traveling for various publications. He said, but nothing shot fear through him like the sudden thought that those people in the painting heading towards judgment have a modern look to them. The painting's 400 or 500 years old, but he said the hairstyles, the look of the people in the painting resembled himself and his contemporaries, and all of a sudden began to ponder his own sins and how he knew he was guilty, and if the judgment of God was true, then he would certainly be facing it. And, the way he writes, he doesn't have a real clear description of his conversion to the Lord Jesus as a believer. He returned to the Church of England, where he said he had been brought up as a young boy, only he gets there too late, discovering that they have abandoned the King James Bible, abandoned the rules of Christian conduct by Thomas Cranmer, and things that the Church of England used to depend upon. It's all part of their worship. And he said the King James Bible is what affected the speech of every Englishman. And the idea that they would abandon it, it just gave him shudders. And so I don't pretend to fully identify with an Englishman who still thinks there's some good and something redeemable in the Church of England. To me, that's not my cup of tea, so to speak. But he, no pun intended, but he nevertheless is a believing Brit. He's a believer. And not only is he a believer, he's a King James believer. Somehow still going to the Church of England, hoping to redeem something among its clergy, hoping to find something. But maybe our way of worship here in the U.S., us shouting Baptists, might be a little too much for his sensibilities. I can't say. But very interesting book The Rage Against God is the title of his book, how he went from atheism to becoming a believer, and how simple idea of final judgment pricked his conscience to begin seeking out Jesus Christ. And of course, because of his conversion, he said the realization of his own sins haunted him when he saw that picture, and he says that feeling has been with him ever since, for 30 years, since he was saved. Of course, all of those years he and his brother were estranged from each other. His brother, the most famous atheist in the world, before he died in 2011. There's an interesting book called The Probability of God by a PhD from Manchester University, United Kingdom, named Stephen Unwin. A simple calculation that proves the ultimate truth. And it's actually quite humorous and entertaining. But he has a PhD in theoretical physics, and his research in the field of quantum gravity. Already you've lost me. I have no idea what all that involves. But president of his own consulting firm specializing in risk management for various Fortune 500 clients who he lives in Columbus, Ohio. Risk management would be fixing the odds and probabilities of a new product launch to either succeed or fail. What are the needs of such a product in the market right now? Is it worth this much investment? And what are your odds of success, and so forth? Well, he goes through and he calculates on a scale of 0 to 100 the odds that the loving personal God that you and I believe in exists. And he tries to weigh all the pros and cons and weigh every variable for each element that we ascribe to God: goodness, kindness, loving, interested in our affairs, can be contacted through prayer, and so forth, reveals himself to us. He goes through all of those elements that we ascribe to God and tries to consider all the variables and the odds for and against. And he comes to the conclusion towards the end of the book that there's a 67% probability that such a God does in fact exist. He makes no profession of being a believer, so I figure that's pretty good for a guy that doesn't claim to be a believer. This was an interesting book, and like I say, you can borrow any of these from me. It's a small little paperback. I'd like to get more copies of it and make sure everybody takes one home, called The Return of the Village Atheist. It's like the expression the village idiot, only he took off on that phrase and called it the village atheist. A guy named Joel McDermott. And he doesn't hold back, complaining that atheism as the official policy of the Soviet Union led to the death of millions. And here's one called 20 Compelling Evidences That God Exists. And this looks like pretty easy. I haven't finished this book, but everything is double-spaced, so you can make pretty good speed reading through the chapters. 20 Compelling Evidences That God Exists by a man named Kenneth Boa. And two more books here. This one's simply called God, the Evidence. It states basically, what do we know from scientific studies and clinical studies of people, out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, or their sense, or the fact that through prayer and through seeking after God's help, a sick patient recovers more quickly than someone who has no interest in God, no desire for God. I read to you a newspaper article not long ago, or just recently on Wednesday night, about someone who's a pessimist. Pessimism actually leads to Alzheimer's, or has a contributing factor towards Alzheimer's, the attitude you have. And an atheist is certainly a pessimist. He doesn't believe there's anything good about religion, good about faith in God, good about the Lord Jesus Christ, good about the Scriptures. Everything is a negative. There's not this, there's not that. There's no such thing as miracles. There's no life after death. There's no God listening to your prayers. There's no such thing as communicating to a deity through prayer. There's no divine revelation. Everything is material. And by the way, not only does that kind of thinking lead to increase your likelihood of Alzheimer's, but it also, and dementia, but it also leads to misery. My brother-in-law Marty and I were talking last night about these people who are caught up in the homosexual life and the gay lifestyle, who are high. They have a very high statistic of alcoholism among themselves. They don't think the God of the Bible, as we read about him in the Scriptures, exists, or they don't want to admit that he exists because that might mean there's judgment coming to them for the way they live. And they, along with the atheists, have a very high rate of alcoholism because they're miserable. And one last book I've mentioned in the past. This one's called The Spiritual Brain. It's a book by a neuroscientist named Mario Beauregard from the University of Toronto, Canada. And it's thick print, a lot of technical jargon in it. But he basically says there's a component in every person that cannot be summarized simply by flesh and blood and enzymes and molecules and proteins and chemicals inside the body. You cannot simply say a person is only the total of all the physical elements that make them up. And early in the book, he cites what's called the placebo effect. You can give someone a sugar pill and tell them it's the most powerful medicine being experimented with right now to cure their problem. And if they believe it, their symptoms go away and they actually get better, and they've taken absolutely no medicine to help themselves get better. Something inside them caused the turnaround in their physical health. And he said you cannot explain that simply by the chemicals and the molecular makeup of human beings. He talks about the out-of-body experiences by people who flatlined in the operating room. They were clinically dead, and yet when they were resuscitated could explain in detail things that were going on during that flatline period. And you cannot account for it any other way. How is it that the human brain replaces its own cells, I forget how many times, thousands of times over the course of your life? And yet you have a consistent and a continual sense of memory. Your brain, which stores all of that information, remembers the details of your past and your life and events in the past, and yet those individual cells are constantly replacing themselves. How is it they die and a new one is born and takes its place, but your perception of yourself, your memories of the past remain? How are they transferred from one cell to the other if memory is simply just a concept out there? It shouldn't happen at all if all you and I are chemical products of evolution with no purpose to life, no designer behind it, no God, divine God. And so those are just a number of books on the subject of atheism and the existence of God. And you're welcome to see me if you want about borrowing any of those. I'll give you 2 whole days to read one of those books, and but you can see me about that in the future. This will be the introduction to our new series, and our new series will be on basic theology. Part 1 we will commence with next Sunday at the same time.